Hello to all the social studies fans out there. Welcome to lesson 3 of Unit 2B. In this lesson, as you can tell, you're going to learn all about the Cold War. Right on. So as we go through this lesson, you can complete the partial notes that were handed out in class. Here are the partial notes. There's a digital copy of these partial notes in D2L. And in the content section of D2L, you can find these notes. So you just fill in the keywords. If you don't have a copy of them, and if you don't have a printer to print them out, then you can just copy down the notes on a separate piece of paper, just any piece of paper. And then when you come back to class, I can give you the partial notes, and then you can recopy them onto the partial notes, or you can just keep your own separate piece of paper as your notes. It's totally up to you. It doesn't really matter to me how you do it, but the Cold War. All right, here we go. So let's get into it. So here's another picture of the Cold War. Which two superpowers do you see here? Well, on the left, right, in the west of the world, you see the United States and all of the allies and friends of the United States. And then on the right side, or in the east, you see the Soviet Union and all the allies and friends of the Soviet Union. Okay, here's another picture of the Cold War. All right, another picture of the Cold War. All right, so as you can tell in your partial notes, this lesson is split into 3 parts. So part A is all about the beginning of the Cold War. Okay, so how it started in the first place. Okay, so the question for this section is going to be, how can competing ideologies create tension in international affairs? Okay, so we've learned about ideologies, right? We've learned about different ideologies. In this lesson, we see how the different ideologies of liberalism and communism came into conflict with each other and how that impacted international affairs. So here's a quote from Joseph Stalin. In 1927, he was visiting the United States, actually, and he was speaking to some labor unions. And here's what he said to the labor unions. He said, "In the future, there will emerge 2 centers of world significance, a socialist or communist center, drawing to itself the countries that incline towards socialism, and a capitalist and liberal center, drawing to itself the countries that incline towards capitalism and liberalism. Battle between these 2 centers for command of the world economy will decide the fate of capitalism and communism in the entire world." Wow. So he was right. He predicted the Cold War very accurately. So the story starts with World War II. So we don't talk much about World War II in this course, unfortunately. But as you probably know, World War II, at least in Europe, looks a little bit like this, right? So Germany attacks in the east, right? And they attack Poland, they attack the Balkans. Many Balkan states fall under German control. And the Nazis then turn on the Soviet Union and they attack the Russians as well, and they make their way into Russia. At the same time, they're attacking Northern Europe and they're attacking Western Europe, and even making war in North Africa. Okay, so Germany is attacking on several fronts. Well, just to simplify things very, very much, we have Western allies such as Britain and Canada and the United States. They attack the Germans here in France, and they push from the west, and they push the Nazi army all the way back into Germany, right? And then from the east over here, we have the USSR, right? The Soviet Union, the Soviet troops, the Red Army. They push the Germans back into Germany coming from the east. So at the end of World War II, Europe is looking like this. So we have countries that have been liberated by Western liberal countries, such as Britain and the United States and Canada. And then we have countries over here which have been liberated by the Soviet army. And so these countries got together towards the end of World War II to discuss a plan for Europe's future. And this conference was called the Yalta Conference. And so here in this picture, you can see the leaders of the 3 most powerful countries at the time. All right, so we have Winston Churchill over here, all right, the leader of Great Britain. We have Franklin D. Roosevelt or FDR, right? You remember learning about him, learning about the New Deal, right? So he was president of the United States at the time. And here we have Joseph Stalin, right? As you know from the last lesson, he was the leader of the Soviet Union, right? And here we have Darth Vader. Okay, he was also there, of course. And so this was a quote coming from an advisor to President Roosevelt during the Yalta Conference. He said, "We really believed in our hearts that this Yalta Agreement was the dawn of the new day we'd all been praying for and talking about for so many years. And the Russians had proved that they could be reasonable and far-seeing." So it was looking pretty good in the Yalta Conference. They believed that, hey, they might be able to kind of work things out. And so they came up with some agreements. One of the agreements was that they were going to divide Germany into 4 zones of occupation. Okay, so there was going to be a British zone, an American zone, a French zone, and a Soviet zone. So here we have the British zone in green, the French zone in blue, the American zone in orange, and then the Soviet zone in red. All right, and now the capital of Germany is and was Berlin. So where is Berlin? Well, take a look here in the Soviet zone. Here we have the city of Berlin. Well, Berlin itself was divided into 4 zones as well. So we had the Soviet zone here in the east in red, the American zone, British, and the French zone. So they really divided Germany and Berlin up among the countries who had liberated much of Europe and removed Nazi occupation. Number 2, the second thing they agreed to was having free and fair elections in all of the newly liberated countries of Europe. Right, so all the countries where they kicked the Nazis out, they were going to say, okay, we're going to give these people free and fair elections. Okay, so that was at the Yalta Conference. But then comes the Potsdam Conference, and here things change a little bit. From July 17th to August 2nd, 1945, a conference of Allied leaders was held in Potsdam, Germany. And this was just a few months after Germany had surrendered. At this point, there were some different leaders who showed up. Okay, so you guys remember learning about Franklin Roosevelt? Okay, well, he passed away suddenly. And to replace him was Harry Truman, the American president. And then Winston Churchill, he lost an election to Clement Attlee. So there were different leaders, and of course, Joseph Stalin was still there. Okay, and at this point now, Harry Truman was more openly anti-communist, more openly hostile towards the Soviet Union. So what do we have here? Soviet Union, they wanted reparations, right? So money to be paid, and they wanted Germany to be weakened and divided because they did not want Germany to attack them again because the Germans had attacked them twice in recent memory. Whereas the Allies, so the British and the Americans and the French and the Canadians, they all wanted a healthy German economy, right? They wanted a unified Germany, and they wanted like a good recovery, economic recovery, so that Germany could be a good neighbor. Okay, so at the end of the Potsdam conference, we have an agreement here. So they continue with the idea of splitting Germany into 4 zones. They allowed for free and fair elections in countries such as Poland, but other countries too. And then they did agree to some war reparations, that Germany was going to pay $20 billion to the Allies. And they agreed that the Soviet Union would not enter into the war against Japan because that war was still going on, right? War had ended in Europe, but the Americans were still fighting against the Japanese. And then they decided that they would restructure the German economy, focus more on agriculture, light industry, and really limit their military. Okay, so at the end of World War II, Europe is looking like this, right? So we have countries that are allied with the United States and Britain and Canada, right? These are countries that they end up embracing liberal democracies. And then we have countries here that have been taken over by the Soviets, and the Soviet troops stay there, right? And these countries are, whether they want to or not, they become allied with the USSR, and they eventually will end up adopting Soviet communism. So at the end of World War II, there are really 2 superpowers in the world. The USA and the USSR, they both came out of World War II looking better than they did before World War II. Okay, so they had both mobilized their vast resources for maximum effect. They were now building more weapons. They were growing bigger armies than they had ever had before. And they were now expanding their control over more territory and also their influence over more countries towards the end of World War II. Okay, and so this leads to this big competition between two different ideologies. So we have liberalism, which is led by the United States, right? And then communism, which is led by the USSR. And each side feared that the other was going to use this new power that they had and to turn it into war fighting capabilities and lead to a big conflict. And so after World War II, what we see is that each superpower wanted to increase the amount of influence they had in other countries of the world. They wanted to expand their spheres of influence. Okay, so these are countries that are influenced by one of the superpowers, right? So if you take a look at the purple countries, these countries came under the sphere of influence of the United States, right? They became Western-style liberal democracies that embrace capitalism and free market economies and democracy, whereas the countries that are in kind of purple, or not purple, orange, these came under the sphere of influence of the USSR. Okay, so we have American sphere of influence. These are the countries that were liberated by the Western allies. And then the Soviet sphere of influence, these are countries that were liberated by the Soviet Union during World War II. So that takes us to concepts of expansionism and containment. So expansionism, right? You see the word expanding, right? Well, Stalin, he saw the need to expand communism into the countries that he had controlled after World War II. So that would be these countries here, like Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, countries that he had liberated from the Nazis. He wanted to expand communism into those countries that were now under his control. And he said that this was in order to create what's called a buffer zone between Russia and Germany, right? Because Germany had attacked Russia twice in the last half century. And so he stated that I want a few countries between me and Russia who are friendly to the USSR and who will allow for protection of the Russian people. Okay, so he did this by setting up communist governments in Eastern European countries, these countries here that we will come to refer to as communist satellite states. Right, so the United States did not like that, right? The United States, they saw the expansion of communism as a threat, right? So here you see a picture. This is a picture that's also in your partial notes. The idea is that if the USSR is communist, and if they spread communism into Western Europe, well, then they're also going to spread communism into the Middle East and throughout, Eastern Asia, into Africa. The fear was that communism was going to take over more and more and more parts of the world because communism had just expanded in a very big way, right? The USSR had been communist for a little while now, but now they'd taken over half of Europe, right? And half of Europe had embraced communism. And so that was very, very scary for capitalist, liberal countries of the West who did not like communism at all. Communism was the most scary thing to them. And so they practiced a policy of containment. Okay, so containment, you can see the word contain, right? The goal here is to contain communism's expansion through means other than direct warfare. So they just had a World War II. Nobody was interested, well, I shouldn't say nobody, but most world leaders were not interested in starting a new world war. And so American government had the intention of stopping the spread of communism, but without having to go into direct warfare with any communist country. Okay, so the first example of this took place in Greece over here and Turkey over here. So now, because Stalin had liberated so many Eastern European countries, while the USSR was right on the edge of Turkey and Greece. The USSR was right on their borders, right? And so the Americans were very fearful of Greece and Turkey also becoming communist, right? So they applied something called the Truman Doctrine, right? And the Truman Doctrine is this policy of containment that's named after the American president, Harry Truman. So his approach to containment was to create alliances and to give money, give aid to stop the spread of communism. So with the Truman Doctrine, we see the American government under President Truman giving a lot of money to Greece and giving a lot of money to Turkey so that they would not fall to communism, so that they would remain allies of the United States, right? So that they would remain allies of capitalism and liberalism. So $400 million was given to each of these countries to strengthen their economies and prevent communism from spreading to their countries. Okay, another example of containment that took place immediately after World War II is called the Marshall Plan. Okay, so the Secretary of State at the time, his name was George Marshall, and his idea was to give a lot more money, this time $13 billion. Right, so they had money on the table. They said, any European country who wants this money, you can have it. Okay, and for for context, this amount of money is considered about $100 billion today, and that's American dollars, which means it would be even more in Canadian dollars. Okay, so any country that was impacted by the war, if your country was hurt financially because of World War II, you can have this money. You can have some, and you can use it to rebuild your country. But if your government decides to accept this money, you got to do a few things. You need to embrace capitalist principles, right? So you need to embrace the principles of liberalism, right? So you need to implement a free market economy in your country. You must have an economy that's based on the principle of self-interest, individual rights and freedoms, and you got to join this new European economy that we're working on. Okay, so they were working towards this idea of the European Union, where all European countries would work together economically and politically. And if you want to take the money from the Americans, you got to participate in this European Union. Okay, so this was on the table. This was offered to all European countries from 1947 until 1952. And altogether, 17 countries in Europe decided to accept this money and to accept also some technical expertise from the United States. So here you see some towers of money. The bigger the tower, the more money country accepted from the United States. So the biggest recipients, of course, are France and the United Kingdom, but look how much Italy took as well, right? And Greece and Turkey, as you can see, also accepted money. So countries throughout Western Europe accepted cash from the United States. And of course, with that came some strings attached. So overall, what was the goal of the Marshall Plan? It was containment, right? To stop the spread of communism. Communism had spread from over here all the way into Eastern Europe, and there was so much fear that communism was going to take over all of Europe, right? Because there were communist parties in most of these countries that were gaining popularity, even in Western Europe. And so capitalists did not want to see that happen. And so the Americans gave tons of cash to any country who would reject communism and maintain capitalism and liberalism. So the USSR, of course, was not happy about that. Stalin was not happy about it. His foreign minister, he called this a new form of imperialism, right? Where Americans are maintaining control over other countries by using their money, right? And so in 1947, all European leaders, they were invited to a meeting in Paris to discuss the Marshall Plan, right? And so they're finding out who's going to join us in this Marshall Plan. And all Eastern European leaders were told by Stalin's foreign minister that they were not allowed to attend this meeting. Well, Czechoslovakia was thinking about it, right? So here you can see Czechoslovakia, right? They're an Eastern European country at the time. And the leader of Czechoslovakia, they were kind of playing around with the idea. Well, the leader received a phone call from Stalin himself. And he said, I believe the sooner you reject the invitation, the better. Pretty scary words from a man that was not afraid to use his power to do bad things, right? And so along came the Molotov Plan. This was the Soviet alternative to the Marshall Plan. Okay, so this was an aid package created by the USSR for all Eastern European countries that fell into its sphere of influence. So you see that in the East, these countries are now part of the Soviet sphere of influence, and then all these purple countries, they all fall into the American sphere of influence. And each of them accepted money from the superpower that they were now allied with. So the Molotov Plan was the Soviet way of sending cash to its sphere of influence, and it involved bilateral trade agreements between the USSR and these socialist or communist countries, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. So yeah, East Germany. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned this, but now we have what's called West Germany, and we have what's called East Germany. So East Germany, this is the zone that was given to the USSR. They now formed their own country called East Germany, and then the part of Germany that was divided among the French and the British and the Americans, they've now kind of joined into one country. You know, those three zones don't exist anymore. It's now just one zone, and they call all of that West Germany. So we now move into part B, which is escalating international tensions. So escalating, think of an escalator, right? An escalator rises. Well, here we have international tensions that already start off pretty tense, but then tensions rise and things become even more tense as they escalate. If you're in class, you would watch this video. Maybe I'll put this video on D2L so you can watch it as well. It's a speech that Winston Churchill gave to the United States. He was very fearful of something called the Iron Curtain. Okay, he says that an Iron Curtain has descended across Europe. What is this Iron Curtain? What's he talking about? Well, this was the name given to the boundary that was dividing Europe into two separate areas from the end of World War II until the end of the Cold War. So you see this red line, right? In some cases, this red line continues up here into Northern Europe as well. And this is a line that's dividing Western Europe and Eastern Europe between the countries that are allied with the USSR and the countries that are allied with the United States. Right? It's this Iron Curtain, right? So a curtain is something that you use to cover your windows so your neighbors don't see what's happening in your house, right? Well, in this case, he's talking about the USSR and its satellite states, okay? So the communist bloc countries of Eastern Europe kind of blocking themselves up, putting up a big curtain so that nobody can see what's happening in there. And in this case, it's not just any curtain, it's a big Iron Curtain, right? So pretty much Eastern Europe had embraced communism, and the West felt as if Eastern Europe was blocking itself off from the rest of Europe and not wanting to have any open contact with the West. Okay. All right, so it symbolizes the efforts made by the USSR to block itself and its satellite states from open contact with the West. Of course, this was a metaphor. There was no real curtain that had been raised along the borders of countries. It was just this metaphorical curtain. And so we're starting to see that two alliance systems are being formed, okay? So countries felt like they had to choose a side. Were they going to choose communism in the Soviet sphere of influence, or were they going to choose the capitalist liberal democracies of the world who fell under the US sphere of influence? So right away in 1948, tensions rise significantly with Stalin's blockade of West Berlin. And this is called the Berlin Blockade. So here you see this bear. The bear is often used as a symbol to symbolize Russia. And so in this case, Russia, or Stalin, has blocked off West Berlin from other liberal countries of the world. Okay, so Stalin blocked all road, rail, and canal transportation to West Berlin. So West Berlin had 2.1 million people, so that's about 2 Calgarys, pretty much. And if you take a look at this map, here was Berlin. So Berlin, like we said earlier, Berlin was also divided into two different sections. There was West Berlin and there was East Berlin. Right, and West Berlin was allied with the British and the French and the Americans, and then East Berlin was part of the Soviet zone. And so Stalin decided he would maybe be able to expand communism right away into Western Berlin, right? Because Western Berlin was already surrounded by communism. And so Stalin blocked off all access to West Berlin because before that, the British and the Americans and the French, they were shipping products into West Berlin, right? They were doing trade with the West Berliners and allowing them to be a part of this new European economy that was capitalist. And so Stalin decided, hey, he's going to blockade it. And he was thinking in his mind that, I bet that the British and the French and the Americans, they're not going to bother trying to help the West Berliners, and then West Berlin's going to fall to communism. Well, the American and British and French response to this was the Berlin Airlift. This is where Western allies, they transported supplies such as food, coal, and gasoline to West Berlin by the use of airplane. So for 11 months, all throughout this blockade of West Berlin, they had about 277,000 flights, right, airplanes that flew into West Berlin, bringing them products that they needed to survive, right? So at the peak of this, there was an airplane landing every 3 minutes in West Berlin. Okay, so normally they would have been shipping products there by a train or by car, or by truck, but because Stalin had blocked off West Berlin from all access from the outside, they now had to use airplanes to do it, right? And so overall, what am I doing here? There we go. Overall, the Berlin Airlift was a success for the Western liberal countries of the world. And they were able to continue to bring products into West Berlin. And eventually Stalin realized that his blockade was not going to work. And so he lifted the blockade and allowed the West to do business with West Berlin. Okay, now let's talk about the Berlin Wall. This was a time of heightened tensions as well. So as you know, Berlin was divided into zones, right? And the Berlin Wall was eventually built along this border right here. Okay, so between the west and the east of Berlin. Okay, so Germany and Berlin, they had started off with 4 zones, but then eventually it went down to 3 zones, and then it was turned into 2 zones. And what we ended up with was just West Germany and East Germany. Okay? And then the same thing within Berlin. We ended up with just West Berlin and East Berlin, with the West being capitalist and allied with the French and the British and the Americans, and then the East being Soviet and communist. Okay, so Stalin, he saw West Germany and West Berlin as being a threat to his influence in East Germany and East Berlin. And West Germany had accepted a lot of money from the United States through the Marshall Plan. And the West was revitalizing. There was there was capitalism, there was plenty of foreign trade, international trade, and so the West was becoming richer much faster, whereas East Germany was communist and it was not progressing. And so the people in the East, they didn't have the same rights and freedoms as people had in the West, and the people in the East did not have as much money either. And so many of them were actually fleeing to Western Germany. There were lots of people who were leaving East Germany to go into the West. And so they were escaping across the border, but this border was becoming more and more fortified and controlled by the Soviets as they stopped people from East Germany going into West Germany. And so people in East Germany started to make their way into West Berlin, because once they got into West Berlin, then they were allowed free travel from West Berlin into West Germany. Okay, and so a wall was built in West Berlin. So you can watch the next video, which is about the Berlin Wall. There you go. So the Berlin Wall was built a little bit later on in 1961, after they were already a few years into the Cold War when this Berlin Wall was built. Watch the video. The link is in D2L, and it's pretty intense. Okay, there's another picture of the Berlin Wall. So what did Western powers believe was the real motivation behind building the Berlin Wall? Well, it was to stop the flow of East Germans from East Germany traveling into West Berlin, because then once they got into West Berlin, they could make their way safely into West Germany and be free. So overall, there were 3.5 million East Germans from 1945 till 1961 who made this trip. Okay, so there were 100,000 people who attempted to escape East Berlin. 5,000 of them succeeded, and somewhere between 136 and 200 of them died while trying to escape. Okay, now for what reason? What reason did the communists give for having to build this Berlin Wall in the first place? Well, they said that it was to protect East Germany from Western aggression. Okay, so they give different stories. The capitalists and the communists, on the same events, they will give different reasons for why they happened. Okay, so we did this review in class, and now we move on to this other concept of alignment. Okay, so alignment, that has to do with the word alliances, right? Forming alliances with allies. And so in the interests of security, some countries aligned themselves with one superpower or the other. So in some cases, countries would decide, okay, I want security. All right, the world is getting a little bit scary with these two superpowers. I think I need to pick a side. And if I pick a side, well, then that side is going to protect me. And so something was formed that was called NATO. Right? So in 1949, 12 countries formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is also known as NATO. So if one NATO member was attacked, then the other members would assist that one country. Right? NATO still exists today. And this idea of collective security still exists within NATO, where if one country gets attacked, the rest of the countries are going to defend that country. And the idea here was, well, the Red Army, right? The Soviet Army was huge. They had like just a massive, massive army. And there were a lot of very small countries here in Western Europe who were very, very scared of the Red Army, because the Red Army was like right there, very close to them. And so they decided to put together this collective security group, where if one of them was attacked, well, then they'd have some big buddies on their side who would defend them. And so in response to this, in 1955, as a response to the creation of NATO, the Warsaw Pact was created for all countries inclined towards Soviet communism. So we see these two alliances being formed here. This alignment of Western countries, right? The ones that are highlighted in blue here, they form the allies of the United States. And then these red countries, they become allies of the Soviet Union. And this is where we start to see terms like the first world, second world, and third world. Okay, the first world in this case, at least from the perspective of America and her alliances, the first world is the liberal democratic countries of the world, which they also refer to as the West or the free world. And then the second world in this case would be the communist world that had embraced collectivism. And then the third world, that was all the rest of the world, all the other countries who did not really fall under either side. And most of those countries were developing countries, which is why sometimes you'll hear people refer to developing countries as third world countries, which is an outdated term because it doesn't really make sense anymore because, well, we don't have the Cold War anymore. So as these two alliance systems were created, containment continued to be a policy that was practiced by the United States. And the CIA, right, the Central Intelligence Agency, or wait, is that what the CIA stands for? Yes, it is. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, it was used to influence elections and to prop up pro-Western governments in countries that did not pick either side. So if you see this purple region here, the purple region was not a part of the USA and its allies. However, the United States had a lot of influence over this region. For example, in Chile, there was a man who was elected president of Chile. His name was Salvador Allende, and he was a socialist. So Americans were not happy that he had been elected president. And so the CIA had spent $3 million in propaganda trying to discredit Allende so that he would not become elected. And they even spent $2.6 million to support his political opponent. And they're doing this in another country. And normally we would expect that countries would respect the sovereignty of each other. Right? There was a CIA document that came out. It's now been released, so we know about it. And it says, it is firm and continuing policy that Allende be overthrown by a coup. So the CIA was actively trying to have him overthrown and removed as leader. And then by 1973, Allende had died. A military coup had come about, and he was replaced. Okay, which leads us to this other idea called the non-alignment movement. These are countries who decided not to align themselves with the communists or the capitalists. Right? So an example of this is a conference. We're going to talk about it in a second. So in the 1950s, many countries that had had a long history of European imperialism wanted to step away from superpower spheres of influence, and they wanted to determine their own futures. They wanted self-determination. So there was a conference held in Indonesia. So in your partial notes, you'll see that there's a map of the world. You can go ahead and circle this region right here, Indonesia. And it was held in the city of Bandung. So the Bandung Conference had representatives of 29 African and Asian countries who met to promote cooperation and oppose the imperialist intentions of the superpowers. So here they are speaking together. And the Indonesian president, his name was Sukarno, and he spoke at this conference, of course, and he said, we are united by a common detestation or hatred of colonialism in whatever form it appears. We are united by a common detestation of racialism, and we are united by a common determination to preserve and stabilize peace in the world. And so the idea of non-alignment was they would not choose between the Soviets and the Americans because they saw this new Cold War and the spheres of influence that came from it as sort of a new form of colonialism, a new form of imperialism. And instead, these countries, they all banded together to say that we will have mutual respect for each other's sovereignty. We will have mutual non-aggression, right? The idea that we will not fight with each other. We will not have conflicts with each other. We will have mutual non-interference in domestic affairs. We will not interfere in each other's politics, in each other's countries. We will have equality and mutual benefits, and we will allow for peaceful coexistence. We will exist with each other peacefully. Now today, this movement has grown. There are now 120 members plus 17 observer states of this non-alignment movement. And you can see which parts of the world are mostly a part of it, right? It's the global south, the parts of the world that are developing today, who were not allies of either side in the Cold War. They were not allied with the States or with the USSR in many cases. So we've been talking about Cold War and the escalating tensions now for a while, but we've been leaving out a very, very important detail in this story, something that was created in 1945 and something that created unbelievable amounts of destruction and harm for the world. And that is the atomic bomb. All right, so the atomic bomb was created by the United States. They had a team of scientists that included Robert Oppenheimer. And Robert Oppenheimer spoke about the first time he saw the atomic bomb explode when they finally had a successful test after working on many different versions of the bomb. He said, we knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried, most fell silent. Right? Albert Einstein was also part of this team of scientists. And he said, I do not know with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. This idea that we're probably going to set society back far enough that we're going to be fighting the next war with sticks and stones if we ever use these bombs on each other. These bombs were used. 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japanese cities, the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this was towards the end of World War II, when war had ended in Europe, but the war between the Americans and the Japanese continued. And this was used as a way of ending the war. And so here's a description of the bomb that was dropped, the atomic bomb. Within 3 seconds, the ground below reached an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 degrees Celsius. Directly beneath the bomb, infrared heat rays instantly carbonized human and animal flesh and vaporized internal organs of people. So there was a fireball within the atomic bomb, which reached a peak of 30,000 degrees Celsius. Now, to give you some context, the surface of the sun is only 5.6 thousand degrees Celsius. So this atomic bomb was about 6 times as hot as the surface of the sun. Okay, it produced horizontal blasts, which created winds that were 2.5 times the speed of a Category 5 hurricane. People were blown over or they were hit by debris. There was an iron bridge that had moved 28 inches as a result of the blast. So there's a video that you can go and check out in D2L that has to do with the dropping of the bombs. So once the Americans had developed this bomb, well, they now had the most powerful weapon that had ever been created. And this could be used as sort of this trump card, right? This card that, could defeat anything that any other country comes up with. And so they used it to flex on the Soviets a number of times early in the Cold War, right? Like in 1946, the USSR had not withdrawn its troops from Iran like they said that they would. Well, Truman threatened to use the atomic bomb on the Soviet troops if they didn't withdraw. And so they did withdraw, right? Their troops went back to the USSR because they didn't want the atomic bomb to be used on them. Well, guess what? Just 4 years after the Americans developed an atomic bomb, the Soviets now had their own atomic bomb, right? And so the Americans no longer had a monopoly over this incredible technology. So we now begin this period in which this strategy of deterrence is being used, where the American and Soviet leaders are trying to deter each other from using from using military force. So deterrence is the building up of one's military power with the goal of deterring the military advances of the other. Okay, so there's another video in D2L that you can go and watch, which talks about how nuclear deterrence works. Right, so go ahead and pause this video and go watch that other video to learn a little bit more about deterrence. And so deterrence led to an arms race, right? An arms race is when, well, 2 countries compete to develop the strongest and most terrifying army. So it's a competition between nations for superiority in the development and accumulation of weapons. So it starts off with atomic bombs, but then we develop even stronger bombs. We develop hydrogen and thermonuclear bombs, which are thousands of times stronger than that first atomic bomb was. We develop ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, which mean that you don't need to use airplanes to drop the bombs on each other. You can now fire these missiles that contain hydrogen bombs on them to each other's countries, right? And even submarine ballistic missiles, right? So the world becomes a very, very scary place where we get to this point where we end up with what is called mutually assured destruction. And this is this military strategy in which the full-scale use of nuclear weapons by opposing sides would cause the complete annihilation of both the attacker and the defender. So what does that mean? This is the idea that if 2 countries have enough, power and military strength to destroy each other's countries, well, that is in itself a form of deterrence. So the Americans knew that if the Soviets attacked them, the Americans could launch nuclear weapons fast enough. Before they were hit, they could launch nuclear weapons that would then destroy tens of millions of lives in the USSR. And the Soviets knew that if the Americans attacked them first, well, then the Soviets would be able to do the exact same thing to the Americans. So they mutually assured each other's destruction. And some people actually say that as scary as this actually led to this period of great peace and stability, where there's been sort of this perfect balance of power between the two superpowers who never actually wanted to go to war with each other. That's the thing. Both the Americans and the Soviets, because they have this nuclear technology now, they now get to this point where they actually don't want to go to war, right? They're doing everything they can to avoid war, because war would mean that both countries become completely destroyed. Okay? But that still meant that there was a ton of fear. Go ahead and watch this video, the duck and cover video. It'll give you an idea of how scared people were during this time period. Okay, but they had other ways of fighting each other. If they were not going to compete with each other in direct warfare, they would compete with each other in prestige wars. So what does that mean? These were wars of achievements rather than direct battles. So being the first or the best, that was perceived as being proof that their ideology was best. So if the Americans could develop like the best economy, the most money, the best standard of living for their citizens, well, then that would be like winning the prestige war of economics. By becoming very rich, they could show the world that capitalism was the way forward, right? Another place in which they competed in this big prestige war was up in space. So they had what's called the space race. And so the space race, this was this competition to see who can develop the best, space exploration, right? So it was a competition for dominance in space flight. And this was perceived as being important because they were increasingly concerned that wars were going to be fought not just on Earth, but also in space. So they felt like they needed national security by putting their own people and their own technology up in space. But it was also a way of showing that their ideology was superior, right? If the Americans could show that their country had achieved dominance in space, then that would signal to the rest of the world that capitalism and liberalism were the best. And if the Soviets could do it first, well, then that would prove to the world that communism was the best. All right, so what do we see in the space race? Well, in 1955, the USA announces it will launch the world's first artificial satellites into Earth's orbit. In 1955, the USSR announces it will launch the world's first artificial satellites into Earth's orbit. The space race is on. Who's going to do it first? Well, 2 years later, in 1957, who got the first satellite into space? It was the Soviets. So they put Sputnik up into space. All right, so this orbited around the planet for a few months before it fell back into our atmosphere. And it was pretty small. It was only 23 inches in diameter, but it had 4 external radio antennas. It was able to broadcast a radio pulse. That was about it. Pretty basic. 1961, who's going to be the first to send humans into space? The Americans are working hard on it. The Soviets are working hard on it. Who's going to do it first? Well, in 1961, it was the Soviets, right? They put the first satellite into space. They also put the first human in space. All right, so the Soviet man was launched into space, and he completed 1 full orbit of the Earth in his spacecraft before coming safely back down onto Earth. All right, the Americans were furious, right? They were losing this prestige war, and the whole world was watching. And so the Americans felt as if they needed something big to catch up and then defeat the Soviets in space. So just 8 years later, the Americans send the first human mission to the moon. All right, the first man on the moon is Neil Armstrong. He lands on the moon and he says, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And they place an American flag on the moon to show that the Americans got there first, right? This was the Apollo 11 mission. And the USSR tried to do the same thing a few times, but eventually they were unsuccessful. They canceled their plans, and instead they just focused on some orbital space stations instead. Right? So, you know, if you ask Americans, well, then they will say that they won the space race, right? That this was a big accomplishment, and it was a very big moment. This was televised around the world, right? And the whole world saw that the Americans were the first to make it to the moon, right? And for them, this was proof that their ideology was superior. All right, the next strategy that was used in the Cold War was this. Who's this guy? This is James Bond. James Bond was a fictional character in British movies, and he was a spy. He was part of what's called espionage, right? Espionage. You see the word spy in there, right? And James Bond, he was just, he of course wasn't a real person. He was just a movie character, but he was meant to depict a British spy who worked for the British, and he infiltrated a lot of Soviet plots. He was able to spy on the Soviets in many different ways. And of course, he was not real, but in real life, there were tons of spies during the Cold War, right? Both the Soviets and the Americans were spying on each other constantly and stealing secrets from each other. So this is the use of spies to obtain information about one's adversaries, right? About one's opponents. And so there were spies here in Canada too. Towards the beginning of the Cold War, there was a guy called Igor Gouzenko, and he came out to the Canadian media and let the Canadian people know that that the USSR had a spy ring in Canada, and they were stealing secrets from Canada. And so he fled the Soviet embassy, and he came to tell the Canadian people about what was happening, right? And so here he is appearing in front of Canadian cameras, to appear in the Canadian news, and he's covering his face so that nobody would know who he is, right? And because he was afraid that the Soviets would come after him for exposing them. Another important communist country of the time was also committed to espionage and spying on the Americans, and that is China. We're going to talk about China pretty soon here, and how China embraced communism in their communist revolution. So the Chinese government, they stole many military secrets from the United States. They stole information on neutron bombs, on nuclear warheads, and submarine detection technology. And well, they still do it today. So the Chinese, they still use espionage very, very much. And so do the Russians, and of course, so do the Americans, right? Steal secrets from each other, but it was very, very tense during the Cold War as countries did this to each other all the time. Another strategy that was used during the Cold War in order to influence each other is a strategy in which countries would push each other to the brink of war in order to win little battles. So, one country would want to show to the other that they were not afraid of war, right? That they were willing to go to war with their opponent, hoping that their opponent would then back down. This is called brinkmanship, right? This is an attempt to push a dangerous situation as far as possible to the brink of war without conceding, without giving up anything to your opponent. Okay, now this policy is only effective if your opponent truly thinks that you are willing to use force against them. So, a classic example of brinkmanship came in 1962 when the Soviets placed, or they started to develop weapons in Cuba. This was called the Cuban Missile Crisis. So here is the island of Cuba. It's a big island. It's in the Caribbean Sea. And Cuba is relatively close to the United States. Okay, so they have pretty direct access to a lot of the United States. And so the Cuban Missile Crisis starts in 1962. Fidel Castro had just staged a revolution in Cuba, and he had taken over Cuba and turned it into a communist country. Okay, so the leader of the United States by 1962 was John F. Kennedy. He had replaced Harry Truman. And the leader of the USSR was Nikita Khrushchev. or wait, I misspoke there. John F. Kennedy actually replaced Dwight Eisenhower. My bad. So by 1962, he was president. So you can watch the video. So you can pause this video and you can go back to D2L and watch the video that is about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And once you're done watching that video, you can then fill in the blanks of these statements right here. These are the 8 main events of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you can fill those out, but go back and watch that video. Go ahead and do that now. Welcome back. Let's go over these events together. So step number 1, Fidel Castro led a socialist revolution and he becomes leader of Cuba. Number 2, the USA attempts to overthrow Castro with the invasion that was called the Bay of Pigs invasion. This invasion fails. Number 3, Cuba then forms an alliance with the USSR. Number 4, Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the USSR, he sends missiles to Cuba. And then the USA sees that Cuba has these missiles and they order a naval blockade of Cuba, right? So they order their navy to block all of Cuba so that nothing can be brought into Cuba. Number 6, the American President Kennedy, he agrees not to invade Cuba and also to withdraw his American missiles from both Turkey and Italy. Oh yeah, the Americans, they had their own missiles placed in Turkey and Italy, and they were pointed right at the USSR, right? So now here's the USSR escalating tensions by doing the same thing, placing their own missiles in Cuba, which is not far from the United States. Well, eventually, the American president says, okay, we will take our missiles down, right? And also, the Soviet Union then agrees to remove their own missiles from Cuba. And then after that, a period of relatively peaceful relations ensues, right? So that leads to something else called the détente, that you're going to learn about pretty soon here. But here's a famous photo where Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the USSR, he goes and he gives a big hug to Fidel Castro, who had just turned Cuba into a communist country. So of course, Khrushchev is excited because he has now extended his sphere of influence into a new region, right, into Cuba in the Caribbean. There is a super interesting podcast that I recommend you check out. You don't have to, of course, but if you're interested, it's a podcast that's all about the development of the atomic bomb and the extreme tension that is created as a result of the atomic bomb, and it goes through the whole Cuban Missile Crisis. It's so good, and you guys have a super long weekend here where you've got 4 days off. This podcast is only like 6 hours, right? So you can listen to the podcast. You got lots of time to do it. I recommend it. It's so good, but of course you don't have to. Okay, so also in 1949, we need to talk about a major communist expansion. And this expansion is into China. Mao Zedong was a communist, and he led the Chinese Revolution in 1949, and China becomes a communist country. All right, so the United States, of course, sees this as a massive failure for them in containing the spread of communism, right? Because China is the most populous country of the world today. Well, it was back then too. A quarter of the world's population lived in China, and it had just become communist. So the big saying was, who lost China? Hey, how do we lose China to communism? This is terrible. All right, and so with that comes this idea of the domino theory. The domino theory is like, take a look at this. These are dominoes, right? You stack them up and you knock one over, and then the rest all get knocked over too. And that was the idea behind communism, that if a couple countries fell to communism in one region, then the rest of the countries in that region would also fall to communism, right? And so Americans felt like they needed to contain the dominoes, right? So here's an American who's trying to stop communism from spreading in Asia. Okay, so this was a theory prominent from the 1950s to the 1980s that posited that if one country in a region came under the influence of communism, the surrounding countries would follow in a domino effect. So here we have China. China had just become communist. The fear was that communism was going to spread to the Philippines. It was going to spread to the Koreas. It was going to spread to Indochina over here and all the countries that are there. So in order to try to contain the spread of communism, there were a number of proxy wars that were fought. So proxy wars, the goal here was to contain the spread of communism, especially in Asia. So proxy wars, these are wars that occur when two countries use other countries as alternatives to fighting each other directly. So one example is the Korean War. You can add that to your partial notes. And another one is the Vietnam War. So as you know, we're talking about the Cold War. Now it's called a Cold War because the United States and the USSR did not openly fight each other directly. However, they did fight each other through their proxies. So instead of fighting each other directly, they would support opposing sides in local fights, and they would fight each other through other countries. So one example that is the Korean War. So pause this video now and go watch the video about the Korean War. Okay, so go ahead and do that now. Okay, welcome back. All right, so as you see, President Truman at the time, the American president, he was doing everything he could to avoid saying that this was an actual war, right? And both the Americans and the Soviets were doing their very best to try to make it look like they were not actually fighting each other. Because if they admitted that they were fighting each other, then there would be a lot more pressure for them to use their nuclear weapons on each other. Okay, so by 1953, there was sort of a, there was an end to the war, and they decided to establish a border between North and South Korea. So as you saw in the video, North Korea had embraced communism, while South Korea had embraced liberalism and democracy. And they fought it out for a while. The Soviets and the Chinese supported the North, and the Americans, the Canadians as well, supported the South. And in the end, they ended up drawing a line, and this became a demilitarized zone, and that border still exists today between South Korea and North Korea. Next, we have the Vietnam War. So pause this video again and go and watch this YouTube video all about the war in Vietnam. So go do that now. Welcome back. So here we have Vietnam right here, this S-shaped country in South Asia, Southeast Asia. And so this part used to be part of what was called French Indochina. However, in World War II, with the Japanese Empire taking over much of Asia and the Pacific, this region of French Indochina, Vietnam, was taken over by the Japanese. And the Vietnamese fought against the French occupation of their country. However, the French took over Vietnam again after the Japanese were kicked out. So at the end of World War II, the Japanese were kicked out. Well, then the French stepped back in. But there was a man named Ho Chi Minh, and he led the Vietnamese to freedom from the French in 1954. And so after Vietnam had gained its independence from the French and from the Japanese, by 1954, they now had independence. Well, there was a conference that was held. And in this conference, it was decided that the North Vietnam and South Vietnam were going to be divided on the 17th parallel. This would be their border right here. And then they were going to allow for free and fair elections 2 years later. Well, the North was more populous than the South, and the North had embraced communism. And so Americans were afraid that if they had, elections, that the country was going to become communist, right? So the Americans wanted to find a way to, to stop this from happening. And so the USSR and China, who was communist at this point, supported North Vietnam. They gave them weapons, they gave them supplies. And the US, they supported the South and gave them weapons, gave them supplies, gave them, advisors, gave them weapons. Here they are in 1956, giving them advisors and weapons. Well, by 1966, Americans had now sent 500,000 of their own troops into Vietnam to stop the spread of communism into the South. And so there was enormous destruction with this war. 16 Soviet people died, over 1,000 Chinese died, 58,000 Americans died, 1.8 million Vietnamese people died. Okay, by the end of the war, 7 million tons of bombs had been dropped on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. This was more than twice the amount of bombs dropped on Europe and Asia through all of World War II. There was also the use of napalm. Okay, napalm's very, very awful stuff. There was the use of flamethrowers. Much of this war was fought in the jungle. There was much destruction of the jungle. terrible harm was brought to the Vietnamese people, just awful destruction of the Vietnamese people all through this war. As I said, much of this was fought in the jungle. Americans were not used to fighting in the jungle, and so they used this herbicide called Agent Orange, which basically razed the jungle, removed all vegetation from the rainforests so that they could fight each other in the open. Altogether, 9 million Americans ended up serving in Vietnam with the goal of stopping the spread of communism. And this was the first time where Americans were able to watch the war take place on television, and they saw the terrible things that happened. They saw the awful things that their troops were being forced to do in Vietnam, and many Americans felt as if this was not a war that they supported. Right? There were tons of Vietnam War protests, especially among younger Americans. It also very much this was prominent among the African American community, who felt as if, why are we fighting this war in Vietnam when here in my own country, many Americans, many Black Americans were not being given equal rights and being treated fairly in their own country. They felt as if we should, the Americans should not be spending money and troops trying to affect other countries when they had things to do to make life better in their own country. Right? And so this was a big anti-war movement, which we will talk about more when we get to Unit 4. Ultimately, Americans ended up leaving Vietnam in 1973, and they ended up losing the war. The death toll was too high, too many protests against the war, and it was clear that the Americans were not going to win this war. So here's a famous photo of Americans fleeing the south of Vietnam on a helicopter as North Vietnamese troops approached them. Right, so this was a massive humiliation for the Americans as they were trying to win this war of containment. And so North Vietnam conquered the South in 1975, and Vietnam became a single-party communist country, became the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. So this was a containment failure for the Americans and an expansionism success for the Soviets. And then the third proxy war, which you see on your paper, is the war in Afghanistan, which took place from 1979 until 1989. Okay, so the USSR had invaded Afghanistan in 1979 to support a pro-Soviet regime. The CIA equipped and trained Afghan resistance fighters, the Mujahideen. All right, so they went from supporting them with $5 million per year, and that went all the way up to $750 million per year. The Americans were now supporting these rebels within within Afghanistan to kick the Soviets out of their country. Okay, and eventually they were successful in doing that. So this was actually a containment success. All right, so due in part to the Great Depression, many Americans were drawn to communism, especially those in academic and labor fields. All right, so many Americans actually liked the idea of communism, and there were even communist parties that existed in the United States. And because of that, there was something called the Red Scare, right? In this case, red means communism. And so during and after World War II, an intense fear of communism overcame the American population, influencing media and national security. Okay, this was fueled by this belief that there were Soviet spies in the country, also by China being overtaken by communism, the fact that the Soviets had an atomic bomb, they were afraid of the Iron Curtain in Europe, and so some American politicians really used this to their advantage. One notable person was Joseph McCarthy. He was a Republican senator, and he claimed that communism had infiltrated the other political party in the United States, which is the Democratic Party. And all of these claims were found to be untrue. However, McCarthyism is still associated with this idea of trying to uncover and persecute people who have perceived ties to communism. Okay, moving on to part C. This is all about reducing international tensions. Okay, so here we have what's called, there we go, reducing international tensions. Here we have what's called détente. All right, so after the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, the US and the USSR wanted to ease tensions, right? So this led to a relaxing of tensions, detensifying things with détente. All right, so this is a period of time during which tensions were reduced. And here we have President Nixon, the American president, meeting with Brezhnev, right, the leader of the USSR, and they are meeting in person. They're actually talking to each other. So the USSR's motivations for wanting to have détente was the fact that they were overspending, spending too much money, and they wanted better relations with the West so that they could do business with them. Well, the Americans, they also wanted détente because they wanted to spend more on social programs, and they had spent so much money on the Vietnam War. So you can pause the video, take a look at these. These are all important steps towards détente, right? In there, we see nuclear arms treaties, right, where American and Soviet leaders signed a lot of different treaties to limit their nuclear weapons, such as SALT and other nuclear non-proliferation treaties. Right, this is where they agreed to stop testing their nuclear weapons and to stop producing more of them too. So here you can see this chart. We see less and less nuclear testing as as the Cold War continues. Okay, so the détente lasted only about 15 years, and it eventually came to an end with the election of Ronald Reagan and also with the USSR invading Afghanistan. But the détente was a period of diplomacy, right? So this idea of managing international relations with other countries. So we see diplomacy between liberalism and communism, right? Between liberal countries and communist countries. And our own prime minister in Canada, Lester B. Pearson, he was an important diplomat who helped negotiate a peace settlement in Korea in 1953. And we also see ping pong diplomacy, right? So as we know, China had become communist, and China and the USA did not have good relations, but they got together through their love of ping pong. How about that, right? So ping pong brought the two countries together. They had some friendship matches where they met with each other, played ping pong with each other. And then because of that, the American president actually went and visited Mao Zedong, the leader of China. We're going to do a little bit of reading about liberation movements. If you're not in class, you can read the handout, which has been posted in D2L. So read about that. As you can tell, I'm running out of time before the bell rings here, so I'm going to speed things up a little bit. But eventually the Cold War ended. There's the bell, so I'm going to finish things up. The Cold War eventually ended when the Soviet Union fell. All right, so you can read the reasons on the screen here for why the Soviet Union eventually collapsed. And that leads to the end of the Cold War. We're going to leave it at that. I hope you learned a few things. Have a great day. See you in class.